When looking at immigrant families and their communities, we can think about the causes for immigration, um, mostly for the American dream, right? To find work, to find job. Many immigrant women heard about the opportunities for women in the United States and thought they would have a better opportunity here. Others were following their families and for the various reasons that we would see immigrant women coming to the United States. They typically settled in ethnic enclaves, right? Usually in urban areas where they would, know a relative or another family member or, a family friend. And they typically had hard living conditions, as we see here in the tenement houses, what Jacob Riis was really highlighting in his photographs. These really cramped living conditions without running water, without proper sanitation. And the adjustment to American life was difficult. There was a lot of nativist sentiments. There was efforts to Americanize them. There's generational conflicts. There's kind of this renegotiation of identity as ethnic Americans. So there's a lot of adjustment and a lot of sometimes a heavy price to pay. But there's a centrality of family economy to the working class, right? These immigrants come without a lot of money typically, and it's important that every family member that can work do so to support this way of life to be able to get by. We're also seeing this is happening at the same time where there's a growth of a female labor force. And for mothers and daughters alike, we see some opportunities to work. For mothers, there was definitely more of a desire for them to stay home. Their husbands usually preferred them to stay home. Usually they had maybe a younger child, typically had large families, and so there would often be a young child that they had to look after. So options to make money was to bring in boarders, people that, single men typically who just arrived to America and needed a place to live. They would often open up maybe their second bedroom to a boarder who would come in and pay rent to them. And that would be a way of making money while the rest of the family, congregated in living in one bedroom or, some of the communal kind of family living spaces. We see, a tremendous amount of household work that would go into keeping an apartment clean and sanitary. They don't have the luxury of hiring domestic servants like the middle class or upper class women do. They also have the really kind of underappreciated job of holding down these ethnic traditions, cooking traditional foods, celebrating religious ceremonies that came annually, sometimes despite their children's wishes. They were the ones that really were able to keep the ethnic culture alive from generation to generation, especially when daughters would fight against that, in an effort to become or be seen as more American and more, assimilated. For daughters, this is where we sort of see, one historian has called this time period the era of the single woman worker. That means, women are under 25, still living at home, making wages, maybe keeping a small portion for themselves, but expected to give a majority of that earning to the family, to their mothers, for groceries, for food, for rent. And the types of work that was available to these young single women was varied. They were sex segregated, meaning they needed to, the options available to them were usually domestic service. And typically by 1890, 60% of women working were in some sort of domestic service. There were industrial jobs, working in textile factories particularly, clerical jobs, as typists, sales jobs, um, in the department stores and so forth. And a lot of this would have depended on, their education, their um, their race, their ethnicity, the employer's preference for those things, their marital status, their education levels. So there's definitely a lot that went into what was available for different women. And typically what we would see for these immigrant families was there was an expectation that the daughters would contribute more of their wages than maybe the sons. There was a greater tension between the mothers and daughters over what they would dress in, who they would be hanging out with, than we see for sons of immigrant families. So another picture of the Baxter Street Court in New York, one of the most famous tenements of the East Coast. And lastly, we also want to look at the pioneering of the welfare state. This is something that typically young women who just got out of college were getting involved in charitable work, working with immigrant women, poor women who were needing vocational training, or didn't have a place to live, or were recently widowed or divorced or left, whatever it may be. And we sort of see the settlement house as being a place for them. Before I get to that, though, I want to discuss the role of government at this time. Typically we, as historians, look at this time period as being a period of laissez-faire government, where the government really did not have an active role in helping the impoverished, or providing any kind of social safety net to people that lost their jobs or were fired or anything like that. The sense was the economy should kind of freely operate, right? This is a free market, and if you work hard, you will be rewarded, and if you aren't working hard enough, then you will kind of stay where you are. So that's a whole nother area to delve into, but the role of government was very limited at this time. And so the settlement house movement was a way to support those that maybe had drifted under, between the cracks. And women are starting to envision government in taking on a more active role in protecting workers and citizens and aiding impoverished. So the first settlement house was in Chicago, right? It started by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, who in a lot of ways embody what it means to be the quote unquote new woman. They are both educated at Smith College, an all-women's college, and with their education, sort of envision a way of helping these impoverished women. And so that's what Hull House was, right? A house for these women to go to get training, to get childcare, to get really get on their feet and get a job. And there's a lot of what we would think of as the shadow side to the settlement house movement. These are middle class women, white women, who in some ways are harboring prejudice against the lower classes, and leading them and teaching these immigrant and poor women to do what they think is right, what they think is the right way, so to speak. But what this leads to is this kind of new profession for women, the emerging social science field that would lead to protective legislation and, again, a greater legislative role for the government to have in labor disputes, the workplace, in society in general that we'll see come about after the Great Depression in the 1930s. And lastly, we have a college settlement house. We see really the settlement movement, settlement houses popping up all across the nation into the 20th century. And so you have here in Philadelphia, one of the things you would be seeing is often, how to cook, how to clean a kitchen, how to properly, sanitize and wash hands, and all of these sort of, again, more middle class, middle class ways of conducting a quote unquote proper household.